I came upon writing, though I did not know it, because of very early events. My family was, I think the plight, today you'd say it was dysfunctional. In that day and age, it was just something you didn't talk about. It came to a head for me. I was born in England. We emigrated to Canada. My parents, both of them, were continually in trouble with the constabulary and that trouble with authority figures. And we were broken up. My father wasn't around a great deal. He would come home from time to time. But when I was 14, let's do the whole version, because he drove the cab he was driving. He was driving a cab, and he drove it to Niagara Falls and left a suicide note, and then went on to Las Vegas or some such place, I don't know where. This was my introduction to irony, quite seriously, because the RCMP arrived the next day to say, and I've tried to dramatize this many times, to say, well, you know, Mrs. Chetwynd, your husband, and she laughed, and she knew that he hadn't committed suicide, and that began a period of relative isolation. It was a poor neighborhood, but it was still largely Jewish, and therefore quite middle class and bourgeois in its value, which I say positively. I grew up to become resolutely bourgeois, but I had to leave school because my father had skipped on a bail bond, in fact, and the bailsman, you know, he wanted to be paid. So I quit school and went to work at Northern Electric, which was the Canadian version of Western Electric. You know, on my first day, I went down to what was then called personnel, would now be HR. And he gave me a book and said, well, here you are. You're going to make $1.15 an hour, I think it was. If you get married, you get a 15-cent an hour raise, 10 cents every 18 months, and 25 cents for each kid per hour. And when you're 60, you'll retire. And I went from there to the lunchroom where I sat down with some people, and some guy just come back from his vacation, and he put his brown bag down on the table after 2 weeks, wherever he'd been. He said, well, back to sandwiches for another 50 weeks. So I was pretty, so that was my perspective of life, right? I went back to school. My father, we paid for the bail bond. I don't think he showed up for another couple of years, but I went back to school the next year, but was promptly expelled. It was, I want to tell you, it was a trumped up charge of truancy, which was not the case. But he said, as he threw me out, Fred W. Cook was the principal. I still have the letter, by the way, I have the letter, expelling me for truancy and lying, because I said I hadn't committed truancy. And he said, you're better off out of here. He said, we have good children here, and the apple never falls far from the tree. So I've always hated that expression. When people have complimented me on my kids, and some people say, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I actually bristle at it, because so I left school. I was really happy to be done with that. I went to work in a sporting goods store where I met, and they sold, Myrinsky, Lord Sports Shop in Montreal, sold equipment to the Montreal Canadiens and the Royals and all that, and also to the Canadian Army. And the guy came in from the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada. And I engaged in conversation with him, and I recognized his name, Banting. He was a descendant of Banting, of penicillin Banting. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, yeah, I'm here. I get $40 a week. And he said, you should come down and join the Black Watch. The 3rd Battalion of the Black Watch, which was like an Army Reserve militia regiment. I didn't want to do that, but I then bumped into some people with whom I got to high school who, unbeknownst to them, were having a conversation about me in which I was being held up as an example of somebody who already ruined their life. I was at this point 16. So the next day I went down to the Black Watch of the Army. It's still there on Murray Street in Montreal. And I joined the Reserve Army. Promptly went off to do my basic training in a place called Farnham. Came back and immediately signed up for what was then called a call-out. You could leave the militia regiments and go into the regular army for specified periods of time. And my first was to a junior NCO school. I did very well at the Army. What happened to me there, which was quite life-shattering, I came in on parade very early on, and I cleaned my rifle and everything, and you port arms for inspection so they can make sure your weapon's clean. And my weapon was the cleanest in the whole platoon. And Sergeant Major parade, and he started screaming at me. Sergeant Major Robert Jackson, he said, you dirty little man, you ambulatory latrine, actually, was a cleaned up version of what he called me. And I couldn't understand it. I said, Sergeant Major, my rifle's clean. He said, your rifle's clean, but your fingernails are filthy. And he said, you understand who you are. You stand here a member of the Black Watch. You're at Passchendaele. You're at Vimy. And he started speaking in the present tense of all the places the regiment had fought. You know, you're at Normandy. You're at Dieppe. And you shame the men who died there with you by coming out of my parade. And I really had never had a construct wherein I was part of some continuum and could aspire to something greater than the example given me by my parents. And there was a guy in my Tom Goodenough who wanted to be a writer. And I was very glib. I got by in the Army, even being a Jew in the Canadian Army, actually, and did quite well. And once I got in this notion that I was in the Black Watch, I was a Highlander. I was a Highland soldier. Suddenly, becoming a writer seemed to answer all of my problems. I wouldn't have to finish school. I would be instantly famous. No doubt large sums of money would come my way, and I determined I wanted to be a writer. When I was, well, then I got out of the Army and went to work. That was not a good time for me. I had a lot of trouble getting work. But the same guy, Tom Goodenough, who's going to be a writer, he came out, and he also hadn't finished high school, but he went down to a place called Sir George Williams University in Montreal, which is now called Concordia University. And he wrote something called a mature matric, which was basically an IQ test and an MMPI, and, you know, the battery of tests was all done to get in the Army. And on the basis of that, they'd admitted him as a conditional student. There's a great soap opera here, but I did the same thing, and I got into Sir George. I did very, very well there. Won the North American debate championship in my second year. I did it in 3 years. I had a television show on CBC. I became, almost overnight, all the things that writing was going to bring me, right? I was going to, it pays to be glib. But I became very well known in Canada, so after 3 years I graduated. Now I'd also met my wife, still my wife, Gloria Carlin, who was an actress and a very good one, and we started there, and we're still together. Now she wanted to leave Canada. Now until that point, I'd been very, very left wing in my point of view of life, and kind of looked upon America with a kind of a distance. Oh, the Yanks took them 2 years to get in the war. You know, it's a colonial thing, British colonial thing. And she introduced me to West Side Story. I mean, these things had not, you got to understand, had very narrow horizons. You know, I knew very little. I'd come out of a diminished neighborhood, worked in a factory, gone into the Army. I mean, you know, broad horizons were not something, I just didn't have any horizons. Sir George had been very good to me. I'd gone on these things, and I started to meet more important people, and I'd gone to a couple of banquets and learned some table manners and so on. But after 3 years, I had this degree, and a very good degree. I'd done very well. I was valedictorian at Sir George that year. First bilingual valedictory address. So I'd learned French in the Army. I'd been up at Valcartier. And I applied for the Chief Justice R.A. Greenshill's Memorial Scholarship, which was the big scholarship to McGill, normally reserved for the Barons of Westmount and their sons. And when I walked into the room, Max Cohn, the first Jewish dean of the law school, and Professor Durnford, and Chief Justice Tasho, Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court, who always sat on this thing, and he said, "Why do you wish to come to the law, my boy?" And I heard, you know, and I realized, waiting in line for my interview with all these other guys whose fathers owned the Montreal Star, most of Quebec, and the steel mills and so on. And I heard the words come out of my mouth, you know, well, my lord, like you, my family has a long connection with the law because Tasha was only the Supreme Court. And he said, "Really? Do tell, my boy. What is your connection?" I said, "My father in and out of jail his whole life, sir." So Max Cohn, you know, I just froze. I mean, it was like this, it was this wonderful moment, you know, it was like in a snow globe when the snow was finally settled. And Tasho looked at me, and I went like some gesture, and he burst out laughing. And I got that scholarship, so I went to McGill. Had a very bad first year, but eventually graduated, but at the same time, I was under this pressure from Gloria. Now, I left something out. When I was at St. George, I actually wrote a radio play. There's a radio, CBC had a radio contest. I wrote a play called Love Uncle Will. And it was a plane crash, and the family got together. They all loved Uncle Will, but they didn't know if he was, there were survivors. They didn't know if he was one of them. Of course, the family comes apart. Not a very original scenario, but hey, I was 19, right? They sent me $100. And about 5 years later, it appeared on Canadian television under another guy's name. So my first understanding of why writers need unions and guilds, and they do. And whatever else in my history, I never doubted that. While at law school, I got a job working. I had to work all the time. I always had 3 or 4 jobs, and one of them was at Expo 67. In the Expo 67, I met a number of Americans, one of whom was Mo Rothman, who was the head of Columbia Pictures. And the day I graduated from law school, there was a big article. Canadian Press used to do an article on a guy from medicine, a guy from law. Someone across the country was, in their view, notable. And I was the kid graduating from law school that year. And it was a good story. I mean, anyway you looked at it, you know, I mean, it looked good. And it reflected well. It did, too, by the way. It reflects very well on the people who built Sir George Williams, these Scottish barons. All that they taught me, because that stuff in the Army still lives with me, and it still is in me. And in fact, he was I'm a member now, associate member of the Black Watch Officers' Mess. Pretty good for corporal, acting sergeant one day. And it still is a major part of my life, the whole Highland thing. Mo Rothman was in town, and I was asked to take him around the exhibition, which I did. And when it was done, he said, he read this article, and he said, "You don't want to waste your time in Canada." He was a Canadian. "You don't want to waste your time in Canada. There's nothing happening here. So come to my country, America." And I said, "Well, that's what Gloria says." He says, "Listen, kid." He said, "In Canada, you're always going to be called loudmouthed and pushy. In my country, we call the same things dynamic and aggressive, and we think they're good." And I thought, you know, it's true, because by now, the first time I went to New York, I mean, I wanted to cry. I couldn't believe what New York was. And also, growing up in Montreal, when I grew up, it was a series of ghettos, which was reflected in Duddy Kravitz, which I adapted. And so I'd grown up in this tight kind of, America didn't see a battle. You're a Jew, or whatever you were. I mean, whatever you were is what you were, and now get on with it. Not like that at all in Canada. So he offered me a job. That year, I wanted another debating thing, so I went on a tour. I represented North America on a debating tour of the UK. I debated the team from Oxford, Michael Beloff and Jonathan Aiken, and we were now friends. And I went to Cambridge, had a very good debate at Cambridge, and then went up to Oxford. When I got up there, he said H.L.A. Hart, who was the head of the faculty of law at Oxford, had heard that I was a wonderful debater, and he came to hear me debate the next night. It was a very famous debate, actually. It was resolved that this House believes American policy in Southeast Asia is a threat to world peace. Vietnam War. I was defending the United States. The next day, he asked me to go and see him, and I did, and we talked. And he said, "Yes, you know, a chap like you get a great deal out of the Oxford experience." "Thank you very much." We came out, and I got him with Beloff, and he said, "Congratulations." I said, "Well," he said, "he's accepted you. Now all we've got to do is find a college. They'll get you a tutor, and you can come to Oxford." And in fact, the offer from Columbia included the provision that I could go up to Oxford, and they would delay that so I could go to Oxford, and then I would start at Columbia in England, which I did. And so I got to go to Oxford. Didn't stay very long. Like most Americans, I went long enough to get the tie and the cufflinks. So for the rest of my life, when someone said, "Well, I went to Harvard," I could say I went to Oxford and be just a little bit snarky about that. But I did. I went to Trinity College, Oxford, and I still have a connection with the college. And now I was working for Columbia Pictures. And I still want to be a writer now. And I met Ted Kotcheff. I enterprised a musical called Maybe That's Your Problem. Don Black, who became a world-class, very famous lyricist, did the lyrics, and Walter Scharf, who had done all the arranging and composing for films like Funny Girl, is how I met him, because Funny Girl was a Columbia picture while I was there, did the music. And all I can say of that experience is be very careful of English critics. Never name something Maybe That's Your Problem, because you can just imagine what the title, the reviews were just, anyway. The title was just an invitation. The headlines are much worse than the reviews, but the reviews weren't that good either. But during this period, I met Ted Kotcheff, who owned the rights to The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. Ted had done Walkabout, which has another name now. He'd done Two Gentlemen Sharing, and was quite the toast of London. He'd been working with Clive Exton, who was a wonderful writer. And I became friendly with Clive and Ted. And we were having lunch one day when I was at Columbia, on Columbia's money, I must say, for which I will be eternally grateful. And Ted said, we were talking about Canada, he said, no one will ever get anywhere in Canada. You were wise to leave, you know, and we were buttressing one another's decision to leave. I said, yeah, I said, you know, the only piece of literature to come out of Canada that ever moved me was The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. And he said, I own that book. I didn't know that he was Mordecai Rich's best friend. It was very early on in our relationship. And so I, under his tutelage, enterprised the script. I spec'd the script. I would work at Columbia all day. I'd come home, play with the kids. And then Ted was doing theater, I think at the Hampstead Theater, or not, maybe on the West End. And then about, 11 o'clock, 10:30, 11, I drive up to, I think it was Muswell Hill he lived in. And we'd work until 3, 4 in the morning on the script. And then I'd come home and a couple hours sleep, shower, and go off to work again. And that's what we did. And that was how that script became, that was how that adaptation came about. There would be some nasty confrontations later when the film actually got off the ground. I even found the producer and the money because, Mordecai Rich was just, this was so much his life to share the credit with anyone else, because there had been it was just more than he could really handle. And there had been an arbitration in the end at WJ East, which in fact had given me the sole credit, but it's complicated. I'm very happy now with the way all that worked out, and it's fine, and may he rest in peace. But so Ted was my first, and he's a very, very volatile guy. This guy explode. I'm tired, right? I've been at work Columbia trying to be like a big executive. I was assistant managing director. I was a big shot, right? I'm going home and I'm being, daddy to my kids. Then I'm going to see him. And I remember very clearly, it said, I had this scene that began, exterior, the lake, night, because the lake is very central to Duddy Kravitz. And the description, the action line was, even more beautiful at night than during the day. And he threw the script at me and screamed, oh, you bloody writers, I'm a director. How do I make it more beautiful at night than during the day? And so I learned a lot from Ted, and I'm going to be grateful to him. The interesting thing about that is, though, in terms of finding your voice, I didn't have a voice. I wanted a career. I had not concerned myself with whether or not I had a writer's voice. I wanted to get out of Columbia. I wanted to be a writer because I knew you didn't work many hours. It was an easy life, and you made a lot of money, and you could be famous. That's what I wanted. Believe me, and you know the ending to that story. 80-hour weeks. Here's the thing about Duddy Kravitz. When I saw the film, first time I saw it, in the Paramount screening room in New York with my agent, then I by now moved to New York with Leo Bookman, I looked at it and I hated it. I hated it. I thought it was anti-Semitic. I thought it was an unfair depiction of the various communities in Montreal. There was so much in it that disturbed me. That was an overreaction. Not a incorrect reaction, but an overreaction. What I was stunned by was Richard Dreyfuss's performance. And Richard and I have remained friends ever since. He had somehow taken this really unpleasant, nasty alter ego of Mordecai Richards, who would appear several times in other books, including a blood libel and just none of the things you once said about Jews. And he had somehow taken this very unpleasant fellow and made you go with him. He had this incredible drive. It was an extraordinary performance. But I did Duddy, and Duddy would ultimately become tremendously important and change the direction of where I was going. I had left Columbia. I'd gone to work for Otto Preminger. My relationship with Otto Preminger is described in a book available through the Writers Guild about, I forget the name of it, but someone can cut it, the book, and it's a story of how I came to leave Otto Preminger and how he terrified me and what a dreadful man he was. He was an ogre, just an ogre. There was a story that originates with Otto, which I will tell now because The cameraman finally just couldn't take it anymore. He said, "Otto, you're a schmuck. Otto, you are the biggest schmuck I ever met. You are, and everyone on the set knows you're a schmuck. The craft service guy knows you're a schmuck. The grips know you're a schmuck. The actors know you're a schmuck. In fact, Otto, you're such a schmuck that if there was a world competition for schmucks, you'd come second." And Otto looked at him second. He said, "You're such a schmuck." Anyway, Otto was dreadful. It was during that time that William Goldman, I made contact with him again in New York. He used to come and have lunch with me 2 or 3 times a week and refused to meet Otto. I mean, he really protected me. And he figures in this story, this in the Writers Guild book, because he told me, protect the part of you that writes, because he considers being ravaged. He said, whatever you do, protect the part of you that writes. And I would be grateful forever for William Goldman for doing that.
Who are the other writers that you feel you got guidance from along the way and made a difference in your life as a writer?
Well, at this point, he was sort of the only real writer other than Richler, who was not really a good model for me. And also, I realized that I didn't want Mordecai Richler's voice. Mordecai Richler's voice belonged to something very specific. In the United States, that ethnic voice finds its apotheosis, if I may, finds its most elegant and wonderful expression in the works of Saul Bellow. But there's also Boucher Friedman. There's no shortage of the original first novel of Harold Robbins, Stone for Danny Fisher. These were extraordinary literature. This was the ethnic American Jewish voice, particularly the Jewish voice, Philip Roth. Mordecai Richler is a subset of that. He's the Canadian version of it, and whereas their works normally exuded a kind of a spirit and a love and an expansionary, no such word, but you know what I mean, spirit and embracing of life, the Canadian version came out twisted and distorted and angry, and that has a lot to do with how Jews fit in Canada and so on and so forth. But I realized through William Goldman that this whole thing about voice and that he was the only writer I knew. And eventually, of course, Otto, I had to leave Otto, and then I went into just the most worst period of my life. We were living in Connecticut. We were renting a place there. Gloria had not yet found work. She's an actress. She'd done something with the Shakespeare Company, New York Shakespeare Festival, and that was it. They had no money. I was earning a few bucks writing the Penthouse Forum. I did the only profile I've ever written of Bob Fosse, who became also now very important in my life. Now, Fosse, not a writer, but through Fosse I came into contact also through a woman called Audrey Mass. I'm going to get there. I realize I'm on a narrative line. I was destroyed then. I mean, I had no work, had no money, but it happened that Leo Bookman's assistant shared an apartment with Bob Fosse's assistant. And I was really depressed, and Genesis magazine said, if you can get an interview with Bob Fosse, a profile, because he hasn't given any, we'll pay you $2,500. And I went to, her name was Janet Maturin, and I went to Janet, I said, can you get me, she said, he won't give interviews. I said, I'm suicidal, I'm broke, you got it. And she did. And I went up, this is in this terrible period, before Duddy Kravitz had opened. And I went up, he was in David Beagleman's apartment on Central Park South. And he said he'd give me half an hour. And I walked in and I said, oh, Mr. Fosse, how did it feel to know you had won the Oscar, the Tony, and the Emmy all in 1 year? And he said, I got suicidal. Like that. And I said, God, you got to help me. I said, I'm dying here. Give me something, please. I just need something. He said, I just did. I said, he said, don't you understand? He said, now when they discover I'm a fraud, the humiliation will be complete. And I thought, oh my God, this Bob Fosse feels this about himself? What's my problem? And we talked for about 8 hours, right into the night, into the small hours in the morning, and many times thereafter. And I went to see him in the hospital when he had the heart attack. And I went home, and I was kind of refreshed by him and by what he had to say. And about that time, I got a job, my first writing job here. CBS were experimenting with daytime dramas. And Tony Converse and Darryl Hickman, the greatest acting teacher, I think, in America, Darryl Hickman, they were running it. And another guy called Bernie, whose name I forget, we later became adversaries over Vanessa Redgrave playing Fania Fennell. He became a producer. I'd heard they were doing these daytime 90s. And I had a friend, Dennis Considine, who worked at CBS because you couldn't get in the building. So I met him in the downstairs bar. It was called the Downstairs Bar at Black Rock in New York. And he said, I'll take you up. And he took me up. And I went into Darryl Hickman's office. I said, I've got to do a daytime 90. He said, well, about what? And I spun a story almost on the spot. We were living in this home in Connecticut. And it had haunts of, well, you're in Connecticut. You can hear moonlight becomes you. You can see the country club dance of 1939. You can see those days before the war. And it was, we're talking, at that time. And so I spun it to the guest room where this woman is married to this guy, and it's not a good marriage, but she goes up to clean up the guest room, and a dead a soldier who was killed in action appears to her, and he lived in that house as a kid. The ghost love story, right? And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. I must have done that treatment. I did 50-page treatments. I must have done 30 of them. But finally, I got that job. So I had a credit. Now I had a credit, right, which was a good thing. At about that time, I went through the Duddy Kravitz arbitration. And then there was another slump, but I was saved. I got a job doing the dialogue on, I do the script off the outline for Love of Life, which was in the longest running soap. So I was making, it was $250 a script, $310 if you introduced a new character, and I would say my life, pretty much. I was making a bit of money now. And then Duddy opened. What was happening to me then was I was beginning to feel my way through what I've described, never really described that way, between voice and career. I needed to make a living. I had imagined myself to become an artiste. I was going to be a playwright. The pressure of real life with 2 kids and all of that, I ceased thinking of myself as an artiste or even aspiring to that. I wanted to work. I needed to work. I also realized that as smart as I might be, and I was beginning to realize I was fairly smart, really didn't know that. I knew I was glib and I knew I was fast, but the difference between that and feeling you have something a little more profound to say or to think about, or a little larger knowledge base, well, you certainly weren't going to be able to use that in Love of Life, right? So I told myself, and this is true, by the way, well, I'm going to learn craft, because art without craft is worthless. About this time also, because of the arbitration, I started meeting some people at the Writers Guild in New York, Writers Guild East. In particular, a man called Eddie Adler, who was an old-time, reminded me of my childhood, singing the Red Flag. Horton Foote. I was elected, I ran for the board eventually. It was sat with Horton Foote and Eddie Adler, who was president, I guess, then. It was when I met, and the first time in California was as a member of the National Council of the Writers Guild. I came out here, and I met Larry Gilbert, with whom I remained friends until his death. And Larry he understood so much about craft, and his interest, I think, he took it for granted that you had the artistic temperament, the temperament of the artiste or whatever. And I met him when I came out here, actually through Burt Metcalf, who was the producer on MASH. Burt was very generous to us when we came out here the first time. I got to meet Larry Gilbert, and his interest was in craft. So I told myself, fine, what I'm doing is going to teach me about craft, and one day I'm going to be an artist. One day I'll get there. And use that justification to put it out of my mind, which for me was very good. I know there are people who clutch to their artistic temperament and their artistry. That's not my way, and I don't think it's a practical way. I don't think you can declare yourself an artist or a statesman or a filmmaker. There are things you cannot declare yourself, but the community, the pre-existing community of artists, filmmakers, scholars, whatever, will call you that. Duddy then opened these extraordinary reviews. My agent, Leo Buckler, was right. And that took me from there. I got a call from, and I was Canadian. See, they had the first Canadian co-production thing. And David Susskind had acquired a book, a Canadian book called Goldenrod. And Tony Converse, with whom I had worked, he was Daryl's boss, and I worked for Daryl in his daytime 90, is now in charge of the special. He was the head of specials at CBS. And so my name came in two directions at Audrey Mass, who worked for David Susskind. David at that time, I mean, his name is forgotten now, but he was as imposing a figure in the American, because his company, he did the best stuff. He was the quality guy. David Susskind was the HBO, if you will, before there was an HBO. There's two networks. His name on something meant it was really good. He also exploited every woman. All of his executives, women, underpaid. It was a time when you could get away with that. And he had some of the smartest people. I went up to see Audrey Gellin. She'd heard my name from, as I say, from two places. Audrey Gellin Mass, she'd married Peter Mass, was, if there was a poster child for what happened to women of her generation, she would have been in. She'd have written a wonderful novel called Wait Till the Sun Shines in L.A. She's a brilliant woman, but had been absolutely squandered and squashed by the people, the crowd with which she hung out, which were the David Susskinds and Peter Masses, Governor Hugh Carey. That was how I met Eli Wallach. And there were all these people, but I mean, she was a woman, and it didn't really count. But she blew me away. Now, I had three sisters, and my mother, my father wasn't much of an influence. And so my attitude towards women was perhaps slightly different. I don't know. But we became really good friends. I met her, and we hit it off on the first day. And she hired me to do Goldenrod, which I wrote, and she made me the producer. I wrote and produced Goldenrod, which was the first runaway film, I'm ashamed to say. No, not really. And I love that. I mean, I just loved that film. It was directed by Harvey Hart. Jerry Arbide was a Canadian producer, and it was a CBS special, and it was shot in Calgary, before Calgary was Calgary, so to speak. It was about the Stampede. It starred Tony LoBianco. My wife Gloria was in it, and it was wonderful. And it was a tremendous success. And so David then said, let's do a multi-picture deal. And I did. He then sent me a book called Johnny We Hardly Knew Ye. Now, Johnny We Hardly Knew Ye was written by Dave Powers. It was a story of John F. Kennedy. It was a memory of John Kennedy at a time when John Kennedy was still revered. I mean, he's revered now, but in a hagiographic way. I mean, it was Saint John. I mean, a really amazing thing. And everyone wanted to do that book, but no one had tried. It was a huge book. It began back in Ireland, and it ended, with the assassination. And Audie was going to supervise it. And he said, if you can crack this book. I was out here actually for the Oscars that year, and I met him. We were both staying in the Beverly Hilton Hotel, the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Oh God, I couldn't believe it. I was in the Beverly Wilshire, man. I was going to the Oscars, sat with Lauren Bacall. It was about career, of course. It wasn't about, by now, any thought of what I did for a living or what I was doing with my skill. I was learning a craft. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to what I was going to do with it. First time I was making money, which is the first time in my life. I mean, we had money, which made a big difference. I bought a brand new Audi Fox. We were living in the city. We moved to Manhattan. I mean, that's very seductive. Okay. This is a trap that all writers will be tempted with if they have any success. Anyway, he said, he gave me the book in the lobby of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. I thought, I'm getting a book from David Susskind in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. I read the book, and I called Audrey and I said, look, it seems to me you can't do Kennedy's life in 2 hours or 3 hours. But there's one part here I love, and it was where he says, Dave Powers, who was one of the writers of the book with Ken McCarthy, will always remember the day he met John Kennedy, because John Kennedy knocked on the front door. And where he lived in the winter, only bill collectors knocked on the front door in winter. And I knew that because you only heated the kitchen, and you came up the back way, and only strangers and bill collectors. I said, in that story of how he came to love John Kennedy, that will be our film. And that's what we did. It was very successful. It was a terrific little movie with Burgess Meredith playing Honey Fitz. And, it was wonderful. Just a great experience. Now, the whole idea of the docudrama, which that was probably maybe in the first docudrama. I don't know of any before it. I mean, there had been the Missiles of October, but that was different than what I'd actually made a movie about something in present, almost in real time. And suddenly, David certainly saw a career in that, a franchise in that. And that was going to become my bread and butter. That was going to become what I did. I was going to become it was not what I wanted to do necessarily, but a writing career, particularly in the entertainment business, which is what we're in, is a lot like trying to take a bow after the play. As an actor, you're pushing at the curtain, you're looking for where it will split, and eventually you find the opening, you step out, wherever that opening has you. If it's over here, you take your stage bow there. It's in the center stage, so much the better, and so on and so forth. I suppose if it was not quite center stage. It really wasn't where I wanted to be. I turned down the possibility of doing series and sitcoms, which would have made a big financial difference in my life. But from then on, that was what people knew I could do. I did do It Happened One Christmas, which was Marlo Thomas, where she played Jimmy Stewart, and Wayne Rogers played Donna Reed. Although Mr. Capra really liked it, and he called me to say he liked it, and said, it's very interesting. He said, never occurred to me before, but that situation far better befits a woman than a man being left behind and so on. So that was like a good experience. But it started, and I did Miracle on Ice, and I did, probably 30 of them altogether. I did Kissinger and Nixon. I did VARIAN'S WAR. I could go on and on and on. I did the Bible movies, which were similar, by the way. The reason they came to me for the Bible movies, I had done Kissinger Nixon, I'd done The Man Who Captured Eichmann, and the 3 Bible movies, which won the Emmys, it's unusual for Bible film in Hollywood to get that broad an acceptance. They came to me for the same reason. What I discovered I was selling was not my artistry as a writer, right? Nor even necessarily my craft as a writer. What they were buying was scholarship. I got the reputation because, see, these docudramas, Michael Moore, docudrama, when you make a movie, you want it to be both entertaining and accurate, and it's about a real event. Michael Moore, liberated from the rigors of accuracy, but being only entertaining, changed the nature of what we did. But what I was doing was, and what docudramas were about, and by the way, and I suppose also the path to 9/11 comes under that heading, on one side of this political spectrum, and the Reagans on the other side of the political spectrum. That was in the final period of the decay of the docudrama. But in the early days of docudrama, they were to be both entertaining, but they had to be accurate. And that was critical. And in fact, you'd have to annotate the script, and the annotation would often be 4 times the size of the script itself. The so-called documentary now has become has become only about entertainment. Britt Hume, who was a newsman I admire, told me, for a while I had a series on PBS. We were the conservative voice of PBS. It was called National Desk. And we were talking about changes in journalism. We did a show on that. And Britt Hume said, he said, journalism used to be about making what was important interesting. It's become making what's interesting important. That would be my advice. I mean, if I had any worth giving, is that keep 2 things to distinguish at all times. What is interesting, what is important. Try to make what is important interesting. Don't do the other thing. And the other is always distinguish context from content. I mean, I think, Michael Moore's genius is ignoring the real content of an issue and dealing with contextual sidebars and making that the story. Particularly Sicko, I think, was a good example of that. If you go and see one of the last really good documentaries, Hoop Dreams, had an honesty and they just, the truth of it shone through. It was not an attempt to have a point of view. What happened to the media was you had to have a point of view. You went in the morning, journalists went in, they wanted to get their name in the paper, they wanted to get their articles printed, they wanted a career, and so they would pitch a story, and they'd have to make that story seem important, right? And so that's how the interesting took over from the important. It had to seem important, had to be interesting and seem important, as opposed to be important and then be made interesting, right? And I think that's what happened with the docudrama. So I think if you want to do a docudrama now, it's very different than what we were doing. I mean, if you look at Kissinger, Nixon, the last docudrama I did was Eisenhower. Stephen Ambrose had gone to CA. They wanted to do another Eisenhower. And Stephen Ambrose is the preeminent Eisenhower historian. And so CA came to me because that's what I do, right? And I said, I do Eisenhower's life. You know, Robert Duvall did that. But there was 4 days before, you know, D-Day was 4 days late. It was meant to be on June 1st or June 2nd. Those days where, you know, where Eisenhower completely lost his sense of confidence, where they were in the dark and they were dependent upon nightly weather forecasts and so on. That's a great story, you know. And we did that with Tom Selleck, and it's one of the better things I've ever done. I mean, just great experience. But that was finding what was interesting in this very important period. Okay, I mean, I'm kind of trying hard to adjust what I would do if I was starting again today. I depended on my scholarship. I'm not sure that you could do again today what I did or the other people who did docudramas. And John Gay did some, you know. I don't think anyone did as many as I did, about 30. And I think, well, I guess Joseph, I think 6 Writers Guild nominations, 1 award. But I think they're all pretty much, well, no, the Bible film, and then the rest would be docus. It's an important form. And if you can do it honestly, you know. But, you know, I saw that happening. One of the early ones, not one of the early ones, but 1984, the golden period, I did Sadat. Okay, had my life threatened for Sadat. And one of the interesting stories in Sadat was that Jimmy Carter sent Hamilton Jordan to Paris to negotiate with the Khomeini that they would give him the Shah, who was living in Panama, in return for the hostages before the election. In fact, the agreement was reached, but Sadat got wind of it, and he called the Egyptian embassy in Panama and said, "Get this guy out. He's my brother in Islam. I will not let this happen." And I put that in the script, and I annotated it. And I was Gunnar Erickson was a lawyer. The lawyers poured over it and poured over it and poured over it, and it was stamped approved because we annotated it. We proved that was the events that had happened. And we cast, if you look at the announcements, Christopher Lee was cast as a Shah. I mean, the whole thing was cast. It was boarded. It was going to be shot. Then I left Sonora, where we were shooting. It was shooting in Mexico. I left. And when they were shooting that particular scenes, I wasn't there. So then I go to Richard Michaels, the director, and Dan Blatt, the executive producer. And I went to it wasn't until I went to I saw the rough cut. They cut all that out. And they had just said, Sadat decided to try and make peace with Israel because of his friend Jimmy Carter. That had never been the case. He had decided because he realized what was going on now. He was an early identifier of the infection in Iran. Well, yeah. So I stamped my foot, threw a hissy fit. But yeah, you know, I knew about it. It had been done. And that was a terrible, terrible, if that was still in there, we could still be selling that film. And so you see the degradation of truth in the docudrama beginning about there. And I did one shortly after that called Children in the Crossfire, which is about Northern Ireland, directed by George Schaefer. Just Meryl Sharf was the producer. George Schaefer was as important and serious and wonderful a director who had ever worked. He was a wonderful man. Our life was, we also did death threats there from the IRA, who you took very seriously, by the way. My phone rings all morning. I won't even tell the story. I don't want it down there. They'll come after. But you didn't mess with the IRA. And the thing is that in the script, they had a copy of the script. I had put in, specifically named a song, just called The Town I Loved So Well. And they hated the song because it seemed to accept the division of Ireland. Mm-hmm. The last line is, what's gone is gone. Never mind. It's you know, the Irish troubles, the Middle East, there are things that the Cyprus that we don't have the time. But George Schaefer and Meryl Sharp refused to bend. They refused to bend. So then when the death threats came, I said, no, you got the wrong guy. You want Lionel Chetwynd, the writer. I'm Lionel Chetwynd, the kosher busher. They said, you'd better get that off the air or you'll be in trouble. And I said, I don't have the power to do that. I don't run the network. As the story goes, apparently about 10 minutes later, a call came into the switchboard saying, who runs the network? And they got Brandon Tartikoff. And Brandon had to make the decision. And for 12 weeks, he and his family had to have FBI protection because he refused to be threatened. Now we see Comedy Central backing down because of an obscure threat from some two-bit jihadist thing, website nobody knows anything about. So when you ask, if someone wanted to get into that business today, what would they do? I have no idea. This is a different place. It's a different country. The people who used to run this business had a real sense of their obligation to the society in general. They weren't cowed by death threats. They weren't, but that makes sense. After all, it was Brandon Tartikoff's network. He cared about what went on. And where he went, people said, that's his network and that's him. And he was marked by what he did, right? Today, the head of a network is usually some middle manager in some huge conglomerate. I have seen management go from people who are deeply committed to what you were doing and cared about it and would come and find you. I first met Fred Silverman because he wanted to meet me because he'd seen Golden Rod and he liked it. I'd only dealt with Oscar Katz, who was a level below him. But he was the head of the network, right? And so I went to lunch with him. Oh, lunch in those days, 3 martinis, a big steak, apple pie, and ice cream. But he cared. He wanted me to be known to him. And he wanted me to know him. And he wanted me to care and know that the network cared. And he was going to be responsible for what went on that network. And I've seen it go from that to committees of plausible deniability, where nobody makes a decision. It's done by committee. I'm so sorry. And that's true at the networks. It's true at the studios. I have seen them shy away, in fact, from good scholarship because they don't want to hear, but that's what happened. They don't want to hear, don't you understand, we did it this way because this is really dramatic, because that's what life is. I think the concentration of ownership, the vertical, we talk about the vertical and horizontal integration, has squeezed out the Fred Silvermans and the Brandon Tartikoffs. I would make an exception here for Leslie Moonves. I think Leslie Moonves has accepted that's his network, he'll be responsible for it. And in fact, the first thing he greenlit was my Ruby Ridge, which was about the siege at Ruby Ridge, where the FBI, I don't like neo-Nazis, believe me, super Jew, right? But you don't go around shooting 16-year-old boys in the back. I don't care. His father is a neo-Nazi, which was questionable to begin with. And you don't shoot a woman who's standing on a balcony holding a baby. And I went with Edgar Sherrick, Edgar Sherrick now was network head, who had always taken responsible for what he did, and became an independent producer in the tradition of Susskind. He did big things, and we did Ruby Ridge, and we went to lunch in the private dining room at CBS, and I made this pitch to Les Moonves, was he the great-great-grandnephew of Ben Gurion? And I said, look, I don't like neo-Nazis any better than you, but look what happened here. And he was very moved. The last guy I know that really had the balls to run something was Jerry Offsay. Jerry Offsay ran Showtime before the current administration. Jerry Offsay and our politics were 180 degrees. He is a hard-line liberal, and I'm a moderate. But Jerry Offsay really he was the last guy making movies. He was the last guy making TV movies. And he really saw his job as providing a platform, a lectern. And you didn't have to be of his political stripe to walk in the door. And I did DC 9/11 there. I did VARIAN'S WAR there. And I did Color of Justice there, which was a takedown of Al Sharpton. None of which he necessarily felt comfortable with. Maybe VARIAN'S WAR more than the others, although I turned Varian into much more of an American patriot. But it didn't matter to him. He cared that people saw what he was doing to be a balanced and proper view of American life. And some of the greatest writers in America, their last jobs were working for Jerry Offsay. Alan Sabinson, who I'd worked for at Showtime prior to this, when he was there before Jerry. 1988, 2 films of mine were released. One I wrote and directed, which was a feature. It's called The Hanoi Hilton. It was a story of the POWs of Vietnam, seen through their point of view. And it was, I mean, all I can say is that my favorite review, I think, was Leonard Moulton. Who and if the contempt drips from my mouth, I say his name, forgive me. But he said, this could have been a great movie. It could have been La Grande Illusion. Okay, La Grande Illusion is a World War I film in which French prisoners of war come to the conclusion that it's worthless. Okay, that's not what these guys came to the conclusion of. The POWs loved the war. They gave me, I have a relationship with them that is deeply moving, and I have artifacts of that relationship, which reassure me that I made the right film in terms of truth, not in terms of what was politically good. Menachem Golan, who was at that time Canon, who were the last of the fly-by-night. Now, they made films in their own, they were like that. They took responsibility. The last fly-by-night down and dirty guerrilla filmmakers in the tradition of Samuel Arkoff, who did all those old AIP movies, with the original Dennis Hopper films and so on. He said, you'll never work again. I said, no, it's just a TV. It's a feature, but it's a movie. It's seen through the eyes of the POWs. He said, you don't understand Hollywood. He said, you don't understand the ethos of Hollywood. You were saying to them that they didn't end the war, and that if they did, they might have been wrong. Because obviously these guys talked about the demonstrations at home. And they were told every day by their captors, we don't have to win the war in the battlefield. We're going to lose in the battlefield. We're going to beat you on the mall. We're going to beat you in Trafalgar Square. We're going to beat you on the Champs-Élysées. I said, you can't say that. See, you think Linda Obst wants to hear that? And she later told me she didn't want to hear it. So the other film was called To Heal a Nation, which was the story of the building of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which was this great achievement by Jan Scruggs, which was in deep praise of. It begins with coming home, as happened to him in San Francisco, being spat upon and being called a baby killer, and the terrible trauma and how he resolved it. He worked out his problem by campaigning to have the Vietnam Veterans Memorial built, and he succeeded. Those 2 films, backed up by me being identified as the principal source, or as a center of the center of gravity to the opposition to the 1988 strike, almost finished my career. But by 1991, Alan Sabinson was now at ABC, and he wanted to do Don Ohlmeyer, who was, in those days, there were these guys. They were larger than life. He did indie, had a big company, Don Ohlmeyer Productions, did movies, did sports, did the ESPYs award shows. He was a big guy. He's a wonderful guy. And he wanted to do a film about Desert Storm. Well, at that point, too, there was a period in 1988, I started wearing an old field jacket with 82nd Airborne flashes on it and stuff, and I made it clear that I was a veteran sort of thing, which no one was. It was kind of an aggressive, I'd go to meetings wearing it, like, okay, start with me, declaring, you cannot say that I am outside your culture. I'm telling you, coming in the door, I'm out your culture. And I think it helped. They want to do a thing called Heroes of Desert Storm, which I did. Alan then went over to TNT, and I did a series of films for him. I mean, I just worked there and for most of the 90s. We did and tremendously fertile time. We did Kissinger and Nixon, The Man Who Captured Eichmann with Bobby Duvall as Eichmann. This is a wonderful film. Did the 3 Bible movies, just constantly working. writing, producing. It was just wonderful. That Alan left there. And so my magnum opus, which was the Middle East, 4 hours on the Middle East, left to, and then, of course, Jerry Offsay was there at Showtime, who would hire people to do what I did. And so that, has extended. And then with the death of the docudrama, I've been doing features. So I managed to survive the 80s, which was a very hard time for me. A lot of my time in Hollywood, I felt isolated. There were periods of great economic hardship because I couldn't work. And I don't think it was because I wasn't a good writer. I think it was because I had managed to place myself outside the bounds of what's acceptable behaviors. Like there's a lot of Victorian manners, the drawing room manners in Hollywood, and you need to know how to behave and how things are and who people are, and you don't want to be impolite company who is not welcome. And by not bending at times or just pursuing what I thought was right, I put myself in that position. At the end of the day, at least I can say, I feel good about who and what I was. And I talk to my sons quite a bit about it, and they seem to think I did the right thing. But those difficult periods, sometimes it's the temptation to suddenly just do a volte-face. And so I've seen the lights, and I've had were significant. But the point is, I got into docudramas, and docudramas ultimately were about truth. I became obsessed by it. Now, I don't think I ever had the absolute truth about anything, even 88, but I had my own truth, and maybe that can segue to the talk about writing itself.
Yeah.
Because one of the things, of course, I had to do in doing docudramas, you have to dramatize unpleasant people, because there's always unpleasant people. The best example was, I guess, Eichmann. I was not the first guy to try and do the Eichmann story. In fact, I was brought in because Bobby Duvall was leaving because he didn't like any of the prior takes on it. And everyone had missed the point. The point was that he had been preparing 16 years for this to happen. He knew they were going to come from sooner or later. The Mossad agent who was with him never dreamed in a million years he'd be in a room with Adolf Eichmann. So you had an inversion. The captor had been prepared. The captor was unprepared. The captive had been prepared. But all of the others had failed, not only because of that, but they failed because Eichmann was Adolf Eichmann. Well, he wasn't. Adolf Eichmann, he was Adolf Eichmann. And I remember talking to Lou Gossett, because Lou was coming off Officer to Gentleman. And he said, Sadat? He said, but he was such a big figure. I said, not to him. That's the whole point. You're thinking he's Anwar Sadat. He was Anwar Sadat to him, And so the process of humanizing characters and finding their own truth has its own effect upon how you see yourself. And you have to find your own truth. I think the thing that marks the successful film or television program or drama from the unsuccessful one or the cartoon is that ability of the writer to find the character's real truth. You can't just depend upon the actor.
So you would say, which I've never heard anyone, I think it's fascinating. You would say that one of the primary needs that you have to have skills you have to have as a writer is to understand human psychology.
Oh yeah. If you don't understand, in two ways, I think. First of all, in the modern way, which is, as you would say, psychology, trying to understand what that person's truth was. I mean, I think I started to understand what Eichmann's truth was, but also, and this is really important, if you want to be a writer, you have to read, because you're never going to write anything that hasn't been written before. So that's why you read Jane Austen, although I make jokes about Jane Austen all the time. But that's why you read, for example, Somerset Maugham, the wonderful short stories. That's why you read T.S. Eliot. That's why you read the canon, and you become literate, because they've written about it before. And you're looking for truth in some guy like Eichmann. Eichmann wasn't you. If you've read, the ability to show, read a thing like Bartleby the Scrivener, where and go and find that, folks, and read that and understand how people can just absolutely disassociate themselves from the world around them. This is how where Rod Serling came from. Rod Serling was a product of America, of the American literature, the voice of American literature of the previous 30, 40 years. These things don't come out of nowhere. They come from somewhere. A lot of deceptive sleight of hand now. They say, oh, so-and-so is a new... And you can tell, by the way, where someone... Here, very interesting. Because you can tell where that disconnect happens, okay? In the original Star Trek series, Fernando Lamas is playing Khan, right? And I saw that one. And he says at one point, he says, why did you fall, you know? By the way, you see the same scene with Dudley Moore and Peter Cook in Bedazzled, okay? What happened? You were God's right hand, you know what? And he answers, "'Tis better to rule in hell than serve in heaven," which is a line from Milton's Paradise Lost, right? It's very literate. It's Gene Roddenberry writing stuff, pulling out from the great classics, John Milton, okay? So now, 30 years later, whatever, 20 years, I go to see a film with Al Pacino called The Devil's Advocate, I think it was. It's about a lawyer. The devil is now reincarnated as a lawyer. As a former lawyer, that part of it worked, okay? That part of it seemed truthful. What is the devil's name? It's John. Oh, because, sorry, at the end of the episode, Bill Shatner says to Nimoy, Leonard Nimoy, he says, what was that? He said, oh, it was one of your ancient poets. His name was John Milton. He didn't say it was John Milton speaking for Lucifer. He said John Milton said it, right? So I'm going to see this movie, and guess what the lawyer's name is? It's John Milton, because some guy had said, oh, John Milton once said it's better to rule in heaven, it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. Well, you know, that disconnect is irrelevant, I suppose, you know, because it doesn't matter what everyone says about John Milton. But if the guy had bothered to dig half an inch, he would have discovered Paradise Lost, and that film would have been a better film. It would have been a more intelligent film. It would have belonged in the canon. We've reached a point where to be a grand dame, a great figure in Hollywood, to be an artiste, means certain things. One of the things it means is that you have risen above the ennui of the everyday boredom. You are above such things as national identity, religious affiliation. You belong to some grand international elite of artistes and intellectuals. And you see it all the time. You see actors saying, oh, I'd rather go to a dinner party in England because that's what's happened. That the idea of the artist and the thinker is separated somehow, been divorced. And that has something to do with the garbage that goes on in our universities, the way they've been devalued. All right, now. But the really great artists are the ones who are rooted in their time and place. Frank Capra speaks, and I mean, if you don't believe that, go and look at. Never mind the book, never mind Steinbeck's book. Look at the film of the Okies, Grapes of Wrath. Deeply rooted in a time and a place, speaking to the issues of its time, with the language of its people, and the language, you know. In the Révolution Tranquille in Quebec, the great slogan that caught on amongst the Québécois was, La langue, c'est la mémoire du peuple. The language is the memory of the people. So you're speaking a language, you're writing a language. It is the language of your people. Go out and find out where that language came from. Learn about who you are. Learn who the hell John Milton was before you take his name. And armed with that knowledge, it's not hard to get. You don't have to be a genius or an intellectual, but armed with that knowledge and an innate sense of what is truthful, write about your time and place. And don't lecture. The bloody lecturing that goes on is unbelievable. I mean, you know, that's part of this corrupting thing about I want to be a big shot. I want to be at the top of my career. I want to go to the Oscars. I want to do that. I want to do this. What you really should want to do is learn how to liberate yourself from time, because that's what screenwriting certainly enables you to do. You know, you can tell someone who's gone to McKee's class, right, when you teach, right? First 33 pages, setup. Second 33 pages, development. 33 pages to do it. Well, that's not the way life works, you know. I would argue that the greatest film ever made was Lawrence of Arabia, and I would say that Act One is the Act 3 is the pre-title sequence. Act 1 is the first scene, which is a funeral, and the rest of it is all Act 2. I mean, life does not break down into that. So learn how you're liberated. And that never existed anyway, by the way, that so-called 3-act structure that people, lazy minds, attach themselves to in a slavish way. Life is not like that. Would that it were, you know? Because I can figure out where the hell I am in my life, and I don't know where I am. Life is about uncertainty, and uncertainty does not unfold in 3 neat 33-page capsules. Life unfolds by misadventure and by accident, and it has been observed before. And its observation, combined with reflection, produces truth. You can see W.H. Auden. I sit in a bar on 52nd Street, surrounded by the refuse of a dirty and dark decade. Right? It was the opening of September 1939. When you read that, he puts you immediately where he is, when he is, because you know the title of the thing. And it's reflection. He is reflecting. And if you, I know about action writing, I've never done action writing, and that's a whole other genre, and I'm not addressing that. But if you're talking about character, a character who does not reflect upon where he is in life, because reflection is the product of uncertainty. If you know what's going to happen, there's no reason to be reflective or introspective. You become a 2-dimensional character. And we all know such people. And maybe they're worth writing about, but they have to be written about in that context. The most important thing is to liberate yourself from any preconceived structure, to create characters who are truthful to themselves, who, if they are certain, I mean, that's Duddy Kravitz. Certainly, I learned that from Ted doing that. Duddy Kravitz was certain, and nothing worked out. I mean, you know, the only thing that was certain was his uncertainty. And follow them. Follow them. If you are trying to make a character act against the grain, in other words, if you've got someone, you say, well, that's kind of inconsistent. That's acting out of character, right? Then you will force that. Either you've conceived your character incorrectly, or your character's fine, your plot's wrong. If you have conceived of a character correctly, he will never act out of character. They say ontology replicates phylogeny. It's the other way around. Phylogeny replicates. In other words, that the atom is the same as the solar system, and that every cell in your body has the RNA of the entire being, right? The DNA of the entire being. Likewise, in a good script, every scene has the DNA of the entire piece. It is not inconsistent. It comes in the same double helix. It has the same elemental truth to it. And when it's really good, every line is consistent. And it's that consistency to character that will drive your plot. If your characters are plot-driven, I mean, you can, something happens in the plot, how that character reacts should be consistent. If it's out of character, then you must make the out of characterness part of the character's character, if you follow me. In other words, you've got to have a coherent idea of what you're doing, not simply, I want to get to page 110 and fade out. You take Eisenhower, you know, fascinating guy. What does he bring to the job? He brings to the job no success in the field. He had been a failed field commander, unlike Patton or Monty, right? But he knew he was a good politician. He knew he could keep the troops together. He also knew that he was the most powerful man in the history of mankind, right? This is his dramatic situation. He's the most powerful man in the history of mankind. He commands the greatest armada, the greatest fleet and air armada ever assembled in the mightiest armies, right? As soon as he says, go, he's audience. Oh, yeah, front row, good seat, but he's only audience. A corporal on the beach at Utah will have a greater impact on the outcome of that engagement than he is the commander. It's nothing. You're not the commander-in-chief. You're commander-in-chief of nothing. They all leave him, and everyone goes off to their command post. He's sitting there. Oh, I hope I did the right thing. He was aware of that. That's a great dramatic situation to be in. And you play from that. And in that film, actually, I put in Henry, the St. Crispin's Day, we banded brothers, we happy few. That certainty of King Hal, echoing against the reality of what was going on. So what I'm saying is that when you conceive of your character, understand his weaknesses and his strengths, that these are the millstones that will grind against each other to produce something. Because so much of it is intuitive. Writing is ultimately an intuitive thing. You can't, I see all these courses. I'll teach you how to be a screenwriter in 4 days. Okay. I'll come to a weekend and I'm sure that for some people that's worthwhile, by the way. They go and they spend the money to unlock something in them. But Charlie Kaufman, one of my heroes, I don't know, I've never met him, but the film he did about Robert McKee, I thought was absolute genius. Absolutely right where it ought to be in terms of the truth. You can't teach writing. You can teach style, perhaps. But it's one of the things that, by the way, which I think is much harder to become a writer today than it was, is the disappearance of the short form, the magazine fiction, the short story, the half-hour television drama, anthology like Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. That discipline of writing a short story that doesn't require all of the attendant accoutrement of some great epic drama, but a simple story of a person in a simple situation. I think that was just a great training ground in which to learn things. I mean, one of my favorite dramatic situations, a French film called Cléo de Saint-Cassette, Cléo from 9 to 5. She goes to see the doctor at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 5 o'clock she's going to learn whether or not she has a terminal cancer. And it's about Cléo from 9 to 5, what goes on between those two events. On all my documentaries, if you look at them, I never try to tell the big epic story. Never done that. I always try to find some small moment whose DNA will bespeak the entire thing. And in fact, in Kissinger and Nixon, I had Walter Isaacson's book, huge book. Started in Fürth, Germany, in like 1820, and it ended the day before the book was published. I chose to do 17 weeks, the making of the peace in Vietnam, because that really was just rip it off. And I mean, it's just unbelievable. We ended up bombing our allies because our enemy wouldn't. It was unbelievable. You have to see it. It's really good. It said Ron Silver is brilliant, and so is Bill Bridges as Nixon. It became so terrific and very simple, by the way. It was a very simple story. It really takes place over about a 5-week period. And we didn't do his whole life, but by the time you're done, you know what you need to know about Kissinger, and you also need to know what you need about Nixon. And that's why they changed the title to Kissinger and Nixon, because it became about the two of them and how their DNA, I guess I'm stuck on that now, imprinted itself on that moment of our history. You don't have to tell the whole story. You have to find the moment of truth. Kennedy's moment of truth was that he walked up the front stairs. He knew nothing about Charlestown. But, and this is what was important, by the way, this is why I chose that. And so I only did a primary. I did one primary. It wasn't even the election in which he was elected. He carried Charlestown in the Democratic primary against Joe Cotter, who was a sitting incumbent. Now, how did this rich boy who came up the front stairs, a couple of months later, whip the ass of the machine politician? That's a great story. It wasn't Johnny We Hardly Knew You, which began, in I don't know where, it began with Joe Kennedy arriving on the docks and ended with the assassination. But it's as good a film as far as I'm concerned. It's never been done. It was a good film, directed by Gil Cates. Terrific movie. So find that little piece of DNA. That would be my advice. That tells the story of the entire creature, and just describe it really well, because if you describe that DNA perfectly, it will apply to every moment of that person's life. And it did, by the way, with Kennedy. I mean, both for the better and for the worse, I think. The elements of his manipulative side are there as well.
You're a passionate guy when you talk about this stuff, and do you think that writers need to be invested in their stories and their ideas in the way you obviously are?
I couldn't imagine not. I mean, although I don't know. You know, I mean, I guess it's different if you're writing comedy. I've done some comedy. It's different. You kind of marvel at the skill of it, you know. But I guess I'm talking there largely about the docudrama, you know, about, you know, Varian Fry, who was dissolute, had no sense of who he was, and then suddenly understood that he could have a calling, and he pursued it to the threat of his own life, you know. I don't care what the story is. You really have to care about these people. You have to care about them. Even if you hate them, you have to care about why you hate them. And you got to think, my oldest son once said, I said, I can't stand that guy. We're talking about a third party. And he said, well, one of his teachers said, try to see that guy through the eyes of the person in the world who loves him the most. His mother said, really good advice. So if you're doing like when someone loved him, you know, I assume his father, because he certainly spoke of his father as if he loved him. You know, I did a panel with the American Jewish Committee with about stereotypes of Jews and Germans in American films, and Steve Zalian was on the panel with me, and he began by saying that he really did not feel that he should be speaking. He didn't want anyone to think he was an expert on the issue because he had done Schindler's List, because it had to be understood that Steven Spielberg and he had made a conscious choice going into that film not to read anything else about the Holocaust, that they would abstract this incident. This is throwing against what I'm saying. And they would just tell this story without reference to anything else or any broader story, which I thought was extraordinarily incurious. You know, film was very successful. So, because I had a crack at Schindler's List several years before when it was at Universal. But my view of it had been somewhat different, obviously. And it seemed to me that it's okay to do just that story, in the same way it was okay to do just 2 months of Kennedy, or 6 weeks of Kissinger, or 4 days of Eisenhower. But you got to know the whole story, you know. And here, of course, is the ultimate irony. I became a writer, and I did make some money. Certainly, I can't complain about that. But easy life, you know, it's like, it's a long week. You work many hours. It's hard work because you're always working. I mean, I get up in the morning. So they want me to direct a movie. I direct from time to time. I don't like directing. The director's day begins at 6 a.m. in the makeup truck telling an actor, you're fantastic, you're so beautiful, and your work is fantastic, and your dailies are great, and the studio loves you. And then you walk out and worry about how can you get that into reality that day. That's a director. I wake up when I wake up. And if there's been a lot of TiVo the night before and I've been up late, I get up later. And I go and I can work out for an hour and a half, which I do, my girth notwithstanding. And then I go down and I still read newspapers. I read hard copy newspapers, about 5 of them that are delivered to me every day, whilst I have my breakfast. And then I go downstairs and I write. Now, writing is not doing that. Writing can be playing computer solitaire. Writing can be many things. The fact is that once you're stuck in the script, I'm doing something at the moment, it's never away from you. It's with you all the time. And if you suddenly get the idea that you need, and it's late at night, you're going to be working late at night. It is, the writer's muse is a real mistress, and you must service her, or she will leave you. And if she wants to speak to you, whenever she speaks to you, and a lot of it is playing computer solitaire, saying, where are you, honey? Talk in my ear. I need to know how to do this. I need to know how to do it. And I want it to be right. The other thing is to know when you're faking it, you know. Sometimes just to get to a block, I'll write something. And you just got to know when you're faking it.
You have those times where everything just sort of flows?
Yeah. When it's really good, it just happens, doesn't it? I mean, we all know that feeling. It's a high. I mean, it's a real high. It's just, and this feeling of great accomplishment, you know, you print it out and the pages are there and you put the echo facets in it and send it to some producer, you know, pearls before swine, fine oil in a crude lamp. Oh, I loved it, but I got a few notes. Yeah, okay, you got your notes, but yeah, I am. When it's really good, it flows. But that's the danger, is forcing the flow. I'm on this hot streak, you know. There was a time when everyone was doing drugs. You'd see that moment in their script, but you know, in your own heart, whether you have that DNA working, whether it's real, you know. In terms of seminal incidents that affected me, yes, my leaving of Otto Preminger was a moment when I was absolutely overwhelmed by William Goldman's advice: protect that part of you that writes. And I urge you to get the book, it's somewhere anyway. It's also on caucus.org under Me and the Monster. But it was when I concluded I could no longer work for Otto Preminger. And that set the pattern for my life. Ultimately, I had a line I wasn't going to cross for whatever reason. What do you say to young people who want to be a writer? You know what? First of all, don't do it unless you really need to do it. This is not something to say, I think I'd like to be a writer. That's okay for directing. You say, well, I might like to be a director because directing is about, and I do it, okay? But it's about traffic. It's about guiding people and moving things around. Don't do this unless you need to do it, because she is a mistress. To me, it is a feminine compulsion, in the good sense of that, or as a male attracted to it. And one way to know whether or not you need to do this is you have to read, and you come across something, you think, I wish I had written that. I wish I had said that. Oh my God, I know exactly what this guy and this woman is talking about. Oh, I get it. You know, there's that character in, I guess it's Jane Eyre. And I laughed and laughed and laughed. The younger sister, you know. And I remember thinking, oh, I know that person. I know that person. And if that really moves you and you can't shake it, then you may have the infection. And if you have the infection, then do it, and do it honestly, and she'll never let you down. She'll never let you down. I believe that. I have no choice. But don't do it. Don't do it unless you really love the woman, because, you know, you'll end up in a bloody awful divorce, and you'll both be very unhappy. But if you need to do it, and I think, as I say, that's the test. Interesting enough for me, it was more poetry. It was Maul. There was a lot of English people, but to Auden and Yeats. They once asked W.H. Auden, I think it was, what constitutes poetry? You know, what makes poetry poetry as opposed to poetry? He said, excellent speech. And, you know, I mean, I get that, a lot of that, by the way, from Rudyard Kipling, talking of artists who are rooted in their time and place. The gods of the copybook headings. You read that and you think, for a lot of people, his poem "If," he was someone who spoke a very specific time and place, and you know, you look at that, and certainly with film, there are things I've seen in film that I just think, oh my, if only I could have written that, not directed it, but written it, because in the end, it's only about the words. The lighting is important. The actors, the performances are vital. But without the words, it has no meaning.
Thank you very much, Lionel.